I give the floor to you to frame the talk and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. As Homa mentioned, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know it's in the evening in Bangladesh right now. I did want to mention that this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into Bengali. So if you could please click on the globe if you would like to hear it, and then pick the language Bengali. And our friends from Bangladesh are also going to be translating your questions into the chat that are going to be in Bengali. So I'm hoping that that aspect of the webinar is working really well. At Walloom, we are very keen on any type of knowledge production, any type of sort of communication or exchange that we're having, that it becomes as diverse populations as possible can sort of listen. Yes, very, very briefly, I'm going to try to situate our talk because this is part of a project that's happening within Women Living Under Muslim Laws that has been very much involved in terms of women's political power. So one of the things of women's political power is obviously grassroots women's movements, but as well what happens to women during moments of transition, political transitions. And as we know that moments of political transition often generate expectations for democratic renewal, constitutional transformation, and they can expand opportunities for social inclusion. Unfortunately, history repeatedly demonstrates that women's rights and gender equality are not automatic outcomes of political change. Rather, they very much depend on the ability of women's movements and their allies to influence emerging political settlements, constitutional frameworks, and institutional reforms. This webinar today is going to examine the ongoing constitutional reform process in Bangladesh in the aftermath of the July Revolution that toppled a dictatorship, with particular attention to the July Charter and its implications for women's rights, democratic participation, and substantive equality. It's okay if some of our audience do not know what the July Charter is. Our esteemed guest will explain that to you. The discussion also seeks to assess both the opportunities created by this moment, which, as we know, any political change creates opportunities, and the limitations that have emerged in translating revolutionary aspirations into gender responsive constitutional and political reform, but also the way forward. So, the Bangladesh experience raises broader questions that resonate across many contemporary contexts. As societies around the world navigate political transitions, conflicts, democratic crises, and struggles over citizenship and representation, what lessons can be learned about the place of women and gender equality within processes of constitutional reform? How can women's movements engage effectively in moments of political change? And what forms of advocacy and mobilization are required to ensure that democratic transformation does not reproduce existing exclusions within the patriarchal structures? Recognizing the growing importance of transitional learning and solidarity, particularly at a time when anti-democratic actors are increasingly collaborating across borders, this conversation is really critical reflection of that exchange among scholars, activists, advocates engaged in struggles for gender justice and democratic inclusion. So, very briefly, I do want to situate us within the three guiding questions of this conversation, which is to what extent has the July Charter fulfilled the democratic aspirations of women and gender equality associated with the July Revolution in Bangladesh? How has the constitutional reform process addressed the demands of women for equality, representation, and substantive citizenship? And what lessons can be drawn from the Bangladesh experience for feminist advocacy and engagement during periods of political transition? And with that, I will give a very, very brief bio of Dr. Cynthia Farid. Please engage with her work. She's absolutely amazing. But Cynthia Farid is a lawyer, a researcher, and a critical legal scholar working at the intersection of law, history, and governance in South Asia. Her research examines how constitutions encode and reproduce hierarchical visions of citizenship with a focus on colonial inheritance, post-colonial continuities, and the gap between constitutional promise and formal exclusion from equal citizenship. Alongside her academic work, she engages in constitutional advocacy and policy work, seeking to bridge critical scholarship with questions of democratic accountability, institutional reform, and social movements. She has consulted for international organizations and has been closely engaged with Bangladesh's current constitutional reform process as both scholar and a practitioner. She's an advocate of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, an affiliated researcher at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law, and a member of the Center of Asian Studies in Africa, CASA, at the University of Pretoria. She's also a member of the Young Global Academy. Thank you so much. It's amazing to have you with us. I'll give you the virtual floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to jump into the presentation. Just to situate where this talk focuses, it's really sort of what happens after the uprising. So Bangladesh in July 2024 comes out of 16 years of authoritarian rule, initially brought down by students who take to the streets, but then what begins as a student protest evolves into a popular uprising. And within weeks, the prime minister had fled the country. So that was early in August. So the movement really begins around a discriminatory quota policies in government recruitment, but quickly becomes something larger. It was a generation of young people that were confronting economic precarity and also confronting a state that no longer seemed to work for ordinary people. So when the anti-discrimination frame overtakes the protests, what people heard unfairness. They heard stolen futures. And women were already there. Not mobilizing separately, not entering from the margins, right? They were already present in universities and professional and all walks of life. And then the constitutional process began. And this is really where we begin this talk as well. So the protests paved the way for institutional design, and then something happens, right? So women who are central to the uprising suddenly become peripheral to the reform process. And that's the puzzle that we hope to examine today. So if we look at what happens in August, the interim government was sworn in on August 8th, 2024. So that's 3 days after the prime minister fled. The government itself was constituted by a mixture of people from civil society, the development sector, lawyers, activists, NGO leaders, technocrats, some former bureaucrats. Most of these people spent their entire careers working outside of formal politics, and precisely because formal politics had been captured. And that background had shaped a lot of their decisions while in government. Governing a country in transition requires a different set of skills than, let's say, advocacy and program delivery. And the space for political negotiation, which women's constitutional claims require, they generally require politics. And these constitutional claims were not always prioritized. Women's constitutional claims require politics. I'm repeating it because, as many of you know, this has always been true everywhere in the world. So back to the interim government, what they do in the first several months. 11 commissions were formed in 2 different waves. Initially, 6 commissions were formed on the constitution, judiciary, electoral system, public administration, police, and anti-corruption. And then a national consensus commission was formed to negotiate amongst political parties. So the negotiations were moderated essentially within this consensus commission. And these negotiations led to the July National Charter, right? It contained a plethora of pledges of reforms that were going to be later on executed in Parliament through a parallel reform council. And so I will return to the Charter and what the document actually says vis-a-vis women very shortly later in the talk. So these 6 commissions had 50 members in total. 5 were women, so 1 in each of the 5 commissions, and 2 commissions, including the Consensus Commission, had none. The Women's Affairs Commission constituted all women. It was commissioned some 3 months later, and it was the last among the major reform bodies to have been constituted. And that sequence is quite telling because it tells you something about what counted as priority at the time. Meanwhile, what's happening in August 2024 is that more than some 8,300 reported cases of violence against women in the first 6 months. And around this time, conservative forces were actively filling the vacuum left by the collapse of the previous state apparatus. So when the Women's Affairs Commission produced its report, some 443 recommendations on various aspects of family law, constitutional equality, one of the 2 major Islamist parties, the Hifazat-e-Islami, mobilized against it. Now, to be sure, the resistance to women's constitutional claims was not confined to one party, right? Generally, the more conservative Islamist groups took anti-women positions. But this particular position taken by the Hifazat, they held a rally demanding the commission's dissolution, and 2 key student coordinators of the July uprising appeared on that stage. The young men who made the revolution were now on a platform demanding that women's constitutional claims be shelved. Was this a betrayal? They were not necessarily advocating for gender rights, but for them in this particular moment, perhaps it was politics. It certainly was a politics of sorts of accommodation, right? And women's demands were deferred. To understand why women became peripheral to constitutional reform after July, we have to go back to 1972. Bangladesh became independent through a liberation war in which women were present as fighters, as organizers, as survivors of mass sexual violence. The Birangona, or the war heroines, were formally recognized by the state, but they were also then quietly set aside. The 1972 Constitution was celebrated as a progressive founding document, and in many respects it was. It guaranteed equality, it prohibited discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, and place of birth. But Article 28.2 contains a qualification that has never received sufficient attention. It reads, and I quote, "Women shall have equal rights with men in all spheres of the state and of public life." To repeat, all spheres of the state and of public life. If you look around South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, other constitutions have not written this limitation explicitly into the text. Bangladesh made a deliberate drafting choice. And what sits on the other side of that line, personal laws governing marriage, divorce, inheritance, guardianship, inherited largely unchanged from the colonial and sort of Pakistani periods. The logic is quite simple. If you're not free in private life, if you cannot inherit equally, if you cannot access credit on equal terms as men, if you cannot accumulate wealth across generations on the same terms as men, then whatever freedoms you exercise in public life are contingent on privilege, not guaranteed by right. The constitutional order that stops at this particular threshold of the home is unlikely to produce free citizens. So it produces women whose public freedoms depend on the accident of what and where they were born into. The woman who cannot inherit equally, the woman who enters marriage without equal legal standing, these are not absences from the constitutional order, they're products of it. I'm not trying to make a theological argument. If you look across the Muslim world, Morocco, Tunisia, Indonesia, the practice of ijtihad or independent legal reasoning has produced imperfect but some progressive outcomes. The foreclosure of reform in the name of religion generally tends to be a political choice. And the question is never whether change is constitutionally possible. It's always whether the political coalition to achieve it can be assembled. In 1972, that coalition was not assembled. A compromise was made. Women entered the constitutional order as equal citizens in public life and structurally subordinate subjects in family relations. Just as a side note, Bangladesh ratified CEDAW in 1984, but there are continuing reservations on Articles 2 and 16, precisely the articles that require legislative reform to eliminate discrimination and guarantee equal rights in marriage and divorce. It hasn't been withdrawn by any government. In April 2025, the Women's Affairs Reform Commission called for a uniform family code, among other things, a plethora of other things, including also the removal of the CEDAW reservations. That report did not enter the charter negotiations at all. So the founding compromise, just to fast forward into the present, the founding compromise gives us the constitutional template on which 2024 occurred, but doesn't fully explain why a genuine revolutionary opening, ostensibly one with legitimacy and the energy to imagine a different, perhaps a more egalitarian future, ultimately reproduced that template rather than challenging it. Every political transition requires some accommodation. The question is whose claims are treated as foundational and which groups are treated as expendable. The uprising in July brought together an extraordinarily diverse coalition. Students, professionals, opposition parties, religious groups, united by what they were against. They were against the authoritarian regime. But building culture required deciding what they stood for together. And that required negotiation. Coalitions that make revolutions are not the same as coalitions that make constitutions or ostensibly sit in tables where reforms are being negotiated. The revolution required mass participation. The constitutional process required elite bargaining. And elite bargaining tends to reproduce existing hierarchies of power. The Consensus Commission negotiated with 33 political parties. Their leadership and negotiating teams were overwhelmingly male. Conservative religious actors were incorporated into the interim governing arrangement from day one into the inaugural cabinet. When the women's agenda was put forward, it was abandoned the moment it collided with the political limits of that coalition. Honoring the gender equality agenda would have been politically expensive in ways that marginalizing it was not. This was the politics of accommodation, which, by the way, felt principled to many constituencies at the time, including several progressive quarters, including well-intentioned intellectual quarters. To understand why we need to, why this occurred, we need to understand what preceded before July 2024. So for a decade and a half, Hasina's regime weaponized national security frameworks against all opposition. Islamist groups, secular critics, journalists, all were labeled national security threats. So when the regime fell, rehabilitation of previously persecuted voices became conflated with democratic inclusion. It was a principled impulse in some ways, but it didn't stop to ask inclusion of which voices and at whose expense. At the expense of women, clearly, in this case. So it became acceptable to privilege the accommodation of conservative religious actors over the constitutional claims of women. Now, if we look around, this pattern is not uniquely Bangladeshi. You look at Iran, Egypt, Sudan. In each case, women were central to uprising and marginalized in the constitutional settlement that followed afterwards. different histories, different political systems, different constitutional moments, yet they share a remarkably similar outcome. This pattern is not explained by culture or religion necessarily. It is, I would argue, explained by structure. Constitutional moments privilege organized political actors with existing bargaining, typically those who can threaten with and occasionally weaponize instability. The revolution expanded participation in resistance, but didn't necessarily assure participation in bargaining. Consequently, inclusion in the protests didn't necessarily translate into inclusion in constitutional negotiation. But accommodation only explains one part of this. It doesn't fully explain the outcome. To make exclusion possible at such low political cost, something else had to be true. So ignoring the demands of the major Islamist parties would have been very costly. They could mobilize tens of thousands onto the streets. Ignoring women's demands was not costly in the same way. Women's constitutional claims could be deferred without generating an equal and opposite political cost. Why? To answer this question, we need a third diagnosis. We need to talk about women's citizenship. Bangladesh is frequently cited as a development success story on gender in particular. Microcredit, garment sector employment, declining maternal mortality, rising girls' education, female prime ministers for 3 decades. The interim government itself was led by Dr. Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureate, global champion of microcredit, a symbol of this very success story. If Bangladesh has made such significant progress on women's empowerment, why did a revolutionary movement helmed by figures associated with the development progress that is lauded around the world produce a constitutional process in which women's claims could be deferred so easily? The answer is that development inclusion and constitutional power are not necessarily the same thing. What development asks is how women can be included in the programs and state action. Citizenship asks how women can shape power. Development treats women as beneficiaries of state action. Citizenship envisages women as authors of the political community itself. So in effect, Bangladesh created women as development subjects faster than it created women as constitutional citizens. So women in Bangladesh face structural barriers in everyday life, from restricted mobility, criminalized debt, inability to inherit equally or access formal credit. So the garment worker, the agricultural worker, the domestic worker with little to no legal protections are very much visible to the developmental state, but they're far less visible to the constitutional state. And by the way, the additional structural issues bearing most heavily on them, like climate displacement, labor exploitation, didn't at all appear on the constitutional agenda either. The women most affected by the constitutional questions under debate were the furthest removed from the institutions debating them. So this reflects a structural condition. And our movements also are shaped by these conditions. The available resources, the dominant frameworks and theories of change, the priorities of international funding, all of these shape what kind of resistance is possible. It's not that women didn't respond. They did. Women's advocacy mobilized after July, including the march of thousands in front of the parliament. But it also represented a particular constituency, largely urban, educated, professional. The most marginalized were frequently absent from both constitutional negotiations and counter-mobilizations alike. In other words, class fragmentation. So when conservative forces mobilized, there was no counter-mobilization ready in the same proportion. And here's the citizenship gap in its plainest form. Citizenship is not simply a legal status. It's the capacity to make claims on the state and impose costs when those claims are ignored. So the events of 2025 revealed who possessed that capacity. Conservative religious actors possessed it, political parties possessed it, organized elites possessed it. Women, despite decades of developmental inclusion, did not yet possess it in comparable measure. To reiterate, women were present in the revolution, but the structural conditions for translating revolutionary presence into organized constitutional power were not in place when the constitutional moment came. And building that capacity, I would argue, is not the work of constitutional moments. It's the work that happens in between constitutional moments. I'm going to come back to this later, but with that in mind, let's now turn to the charter itself, as I had promised earlier. The charter was not a starting point. It was an output of everything that preceded. So far, everything I've discussed. The primary provisions on women in the charter are clauses 21 and 22. 21 states that women's representation in the national parliament shall be progressively increased to a total of 100 seats. Clause 22 sets out how that happens. Reserved seats, the existing 50 seats, are retained. Political parties must nominate at least 5% women candidates in the next general election, then 10%, then 15, then 20, then 25, then 33. So incrementally to 33. Now, if you notice, at minimum, that's 5 election cycles, right? Roughly 2.5 decades. Women's equal political presence is being treated as something that the system will gradually deliver in the future than something the constitutional order already owes us in the present. And now let's look at what's absent from the charter. There's no substantive equality guarantee with meaningful enforcement. No mention of family law, no mention of inheritance, no mention of guardianship. The recommendation for a uniform family code does not appear, nor is there any commitment to withdrawing Bangladesh's seat or reservations. What the charter offers women is representation, but without a follow-up pathway for substantive transformation. So women have a seat at the table, eventually, on terms that are set by others, and within a constitutional framework that leaves the deepest sites of inequality intact. And now notice what we have found within this charter, what we have discussed so far. The founding compromise is left intact. So equality extended in public institutions, while personal law remains beyond scrutiny. Secondly, politics of accommodation is also here. Incremental quotas are precisely the kind of compromise that emerges when reform must remain acceptable to actors whose power the reform itself would challenge. And thirdly, the citizenship gap is here. Women primarily appear as participants to be gradually included, not as constitutional actors whose claims reshape the terms of the settlement itself. And one final provision, clause 42 of the charter, requires that at least one member of the Anti-Corruption Commission be a woman, 1 out of 5, so a minimum threshold. There's one further and very stark absence, mention of minorities. So ethnic, religious, linguistic, these are peripheral concerns. The charter affirms Bangladesh as multicultural in principle, but does not translate that into enforceable protection. The exclusion of women and the exclusion of minorities ultimately share the same constitutional architecture, managing difference through accommodation rather than addressing head-on through substantive equality. This brings me towards the end of the talk. The charter embodies all 3 problems as we have identified. So the founding compromise, the politics of accommodation, the citizenship gap. But what did we learn from this? I think there are 3 lessons here. The first is that participation must be accompanied by bargaining power. Secondly, constitutional moments require organization, not only mobilization. And that's how you get bargaining power in a way. And thirdly, and finally, women's citizenship claims must be embedded in institutional design, not left for future representatives or future litigation or future interpretation. If you look at Nepal's 2008 Constituent Assembly, it mandated 33% women's representation, and it produced substantive constitutional gains, right? So it shows that different outcomes are possible when organized power is present from the beginning. So the question ends up being political always. But as I conclude, I don't want to frame July as a story of failure vis-a-vis women. In 71, women could be written out of the founding settlement, given the contingencies, war, post-war reconstruction, and so on, and the haste with which the Constitution was drafted. In 1990, which was when Bangladesh transitioned into a parliamentary democracy, reserved seats were the ceiling of what was politically imaginable. But in 2024, women were so visibly present in the uprising that complete exclusion was no longer possible, even if substantive inclusion remained elusive, ultimately. So the reason why post-July settlement may have been disappointing for women's rights is precisely because so much more was possible. There was a window. And that's not nothing. That's the slow accumulation of the feminist project across generations. And that accumulation happens through very unglamorous work, chipping away at structural barriers between constitutional movements, building movements that are rooted in everyday struggles. There's going to be no substantive democracy without equality. A constitutional order that manages women's
I think there's an internet issue.
Dr. Cynthia, did we lose you? I think your image ends up being frozen.
I feel there was an internet issue with
Perhaps,
our
yes.
platform.
Hopefully she's going to join us in a minute. I love the conclusion we were at.
I know, I was looking forward to it.
It was just at that moment of, okay, what to do?
I'm guessing we've lost Dr. Cynthia.
Maybe now that we can, if she comes back, of course, then we will continue. But maybe we can ask well done, either you or I think Sarah Hussein is with us. Hopefully
That's
we
right.
can-
That's right. Yes. Dear Sarah, sorry.
Sorry, in the middle of dinner.
Sorry.
Should I just check if Cynthia's coming back? I'm sure she will.
Actually, I just admitted her.
Brilliant. So let's just wait for her and comment
Okay.
Sure.
afterwards.
Oh, there she is.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I don't know at what point you lost me.
We lost you at the sentence where you said there is no substantive democracy without equality.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'll just begin where I left off. So what I was saying was that, so a constitutional order needs to guarantee women's power, right? So it's if it doesn't do that, so there's no substantive democracy without equality, and without equality, it's not really a democracy in the fullest sense. So the lesson is not simply that women must preserve the gains that they've already made. No gain is permanently secured, right? So if you look around the world, we've seen how quickly rights, representation, even participation can be rolled back. Tunisia is a case in point, right? Since 2014, it took some 10 years to reverse that. And so constitutional and citizenship and democracy are ongoing political projects. And these have to be defended, expanded, and renewed across generations. And so if we accept these as ongoing political projects, then no contemporary feminist project can be understood solely within national borders. So if you look at this platform, right, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, where I've been very graciously invited to speak, this platform has spent years building exactly the kind of transnational feminist infrastructure that constitutional moments require, but usually cannot produce on their own. So knowledge network, solidarity across borders, the insistence that what happens to women in Bangladesh is not separate to what happens to women in Iran, in Sudan, in Syria, in Palestine. So that work matters, the collaboration matters, not as a supplement to constitutional politics, but as one of its foundations. The young women of July made a constitutional claim. They demanded to be recognized not merely as beneficiaries of the nation, but as co-authors of the nation. So individual instances of violence that we encounter generate daily outrage, and we have plenty of that. But outrage is not the same as systemic change. And it's systemic change that constitutional power makes possible. That claim has not been answered by the July Charter, but it hasn't gone away either. So the question for all of us here, scholars, activists, advocates, everyone here today, is what do we do between constitutional moments to ensure that when the next one comes, and it will, the organized power to answer that claim is already in place. I'm going to end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that conclusion, and thank you so much for bringing it together on whatever happens within a border is quite significant, yet the transnational aspect of it is also very significant, that we need to consciously learn from one another, learn about the mistakes and sort of the opportunities that are there, and that recognizing that it is a process and that there does require a lot of sustained pressuring. Homajan, I'm gonna give you the floor. I'm wondering if you have some things to add, and who else from our friends in Bangladesh can contribute.
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent talk. As you were talking, of course, I went back in my mind because I was part of the Iranian Revolution, and then Sudan, and then Tunisia, and I said, yes, we really need to be very conscious of all these developments and learn and talk about the different strategies, what went wrong, but also what can be done, so that when the next revolution happens or next reform happens, we know what we want and how we should go about it, and also make sure that other international contact, other feminists are there to consult. I mean, that's one of the problems that I know, that as soon as that happens, men always accuse you of selling out and bringing foreigners, especially these are very, very important, but at least building on experience within the Muslim context will be helpful. At this stage, I wonder if Sarah can join us. I know she's in the middle of family gathering, but I want to intrude. I would love to know her reflection on that.
Yeah, thanks, Huma. I'll make it brief, but firstly, thanks to both of you for your introduction, and you and Mona for convening this, and the really important conversation for us across countries and across jurisdictions about our experiences. Which I agree with everyone, that's a really important process for us to be sort of continuously engaged in. And thank you to Cynthia also for giving her perspectives and analysis on how she sees developments in and after July. I guess, I would obviously agree broadly with what Cynthia said in terms of the exclusion of women's voices from the largely from the July reform process, and certainly in terms of its outcomes, and also in terms of the level of political space given to women. But I think it's, well, I guess 2 points of departure. One is in terms of the analysis of the constitutional equality clause in Bangladesh. I think I'd read it rather differently. I don't think it's that important to focus on the way in which the article is framed about women shall have equal rights with men in state and public life, because of course you read that together with a prohibition on discrimination by the state based on sex, amongst other grounds. And you also have to read it together with a provision on affirmative action for advancement of women and for so-called backward sections, what we would think of as historically disadvantaged groups. So I think we have a slightly more robust and far-reaching equality clause than was suggested. And I think also in terms of the reading of saying state and public life is limiting, that is obviously one way of reading it. But I think another way of reading it is also that has, first of all, that you can also look at the process of lawmaking and so on as being but part of public lives. You can stretch that. But secondly, I think you have to read it together with the actual changes that have happened in the Bangladesh context in terms of reform of legislation or policies, or certainly of judgments and programs and practices, which have actually been more far-reaching and which have also dealt with rights in the private sphere. Most dramatically, I think, in terms of the legislation on domestic violence, which recognizes, women's rights for protection from violence in the private sphere very concretely, which also, in a sense, even recognizes, in a way, marital rape without calling it marital rape, by calling it sexual violence as a form of domestic violence. So I think we have to read that clause and its interpretation in a context and not just as a piece of text by itself. And the other point, I guess, of slight departure from what Cynthia was saying, I think we can't really say that it was a completely sort of elitist exercise that took place, because certainly in terms of the Women's Affairs Commission, it had very wide-ranging. I mean, I think there are members actually here on the call who can speak even more in more detail to that. But from my experience as well, what I know about the work of the Commission is that they had really wide-ranging consultations with many groups, including many groups representing and working and from marginalized communities. And they made a particular point. I mean, they worked closely in terms with sex workers organizations, with Dalit organizations, with disabled people's organizations, with indigenous people's groups, and so on. So they made a point of trying to ensure representation from all of those different communities. And I think also in terms of a lot of the even at the time of the protest, at the time of the uprising, we saw very unusually, I think, or it certainly seemed like a real departure then. Images of Kalpana Chakma, who's a feminist activist from an indigenous community who was seen as a leader of indigenous people's rights as well as a feminist. And she was disappeared back almost 30 years ago now, and her image appeared everywhere. And I think that was very important, a kind of inversion of what we've seen as sort of mainstream figures always being seen as leaders of movements. That was a real inversion of that, and a real challenge, not only in terms of bringing forward an image of a woman from an indigenous community who spoke about indigenous rights, but also someone who very strongly confronted the army and security forces as something which otherwise women's groups don't generally tend to do. Is they tend to focus on women's rights, in terms of family laws and violence against women, but in the private sphere. So I guess that focus on the public, I think we should also see that as very important, that talking about the role of the state and talking about the role of state agencies was something that, was a breakthrough, and it was something that had been very difficult to do prior to the uprising. So I guess and also post-uprising too, in the march that Cynthia mentioned, where there were thousands of women on the streets. Again, I think there are people who are more closely involved with the organizing of that march than, I just went as a participant. But certainly, I think that was a very live debate for the organizers, is how do you represent more diverse voices, and how are you more inclusive of more marginalized voices? And that was quite a point of sort of fissure and contestation within the groups who organized as well, and also led to actually even more kind of, of a reaction to the organizers and to the event itself. So I feel like in the round, we can say, yes, we didn't. Certainly the expectations and hopes I think we had as feminists and rights activists of how liberatory a moment the uprising could be. I think it's fair to say, totally in agreement, that we're nowhere near fulfilling that, and they have very deep disappointment about opportunities lost. At the same time, I think we can see some very new things which are quite energizing. I mean, we can see new voices in the political, far fewer than we would like to see, but we can see new voices in political activism and in the political sphere, including from amongst young women. And they've been really, I think that there's sort of hope there in terms of what they can achieve. And I think amongst the women's rights movements and organizations, perhaps fair to say, I think it's also a moment of deep reflection that you mentioned, I think, Huma, in your opening comments about the Vienna conference 30 years ago and how the slogan of women's rights, human rights became so important to exactly bring in what Cynthia was saying, to bring in rights in the private sphere to the conversation about what are rights and how do we understand them. But at the same time, I think we also saw in intervening years that much of the women's movement kind of looked internally much more and looked at rights in the private sphere and didn't really interconnect in terms of state forces and responding on these broader human rights issues, obviously different in different political contexts. But certainly I think in Bangladesh, we saw that while there were women whose families had been disappeared, and women, mothers, sisters, daughters, were at the forefront of the organization we have in Bangladesh called Mayardak, or Voices of Mothers, which spoke up on disappearance. With honorable exceptions, women's organizations as a whole did not get involved with that, supporting them, and neither did women's rights activists. Similarly, on other issues, whether around the Chittagong Hill tracks and military occupation there, or issues around, detention, torture, etc., we didn't really see many women's voices speaking up on those issues. So I think we have to acknowledge that fissure as well and see how, I think that one of the things that's happened post uprising is there's more of a sense that those are issues that we have to confront in the women in terms of addressing women's rights, as well as talking about issues of women's rights in terms of family law and about issues of violence. And just maybe a closing point on that, I think we've also seen how that gap has meant that post uprising, even when issues of violence against women have come up, as they have done, we faced it during the interim government, and now we've seen it after the elected government is in office as well, that, issues of really egregious cases of violence against young children, for example, rape and murder cases. The response that's come, partly, I think, because of this lack of integration or lack of an integrated sort of perspective around human rights, is that the call that's come for justice has been very much about punitive justice, has been very much about harsh punishments, imposing death penalties, and so on. So not really informed by a broader, I would say, a more feminist understanding of what justice would mean. And partly, I think that's due to lack of feminist engagement with these broader issues. So I think it's still a moment of hope, very challenging, but this has been an important transition for us to have. And I think the thing is we had maybe too much hope and too much optimism of how quickly things would change and how they would change. And we still have, I think, some hope of how to claw back that space and how to move forward, but a much more realistic sense of the need, as Cynthia very well put it, to strategize and mobilize and then sort of learn lessons from each other across generations as well as across countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those for those comments. I think what both of you pointed to, both Cynthia and both Sarah pointed to, is that the whole issue of personal is political has been such a long-term sort of demand of the feminist movement, but it does have different implications and different manifestations. So how do you bring the two together and how do you really mobilize around it? The other issue that has always been a puzzle as well is the issue of political power. When we're talking about mobilization, I mean, definitely progress is so significant to recognize that we have had important gains and we have had very intentional inclusion of diverse, historically marginalized diverse groups. And yet, when it comes to the bargaining that Cynthia was talking about, when it comes to actually trying to include various clauses into the Constitution, sometimes that, decades-long mobilization doesn't make it into those very, very specific sort of bargaining structures. So I think as a transnational feminist entity, Walum is really interested in figuring out, first of all, defining what do we mean by power, and how do you transition the power that we know takes place at the community level, that we know women are very much at the forefront of organizing their communities, of addressing and actually succeeding in, for instance, violence against women and so on and so forth. How do we then get it so that when institutions are being made, when a particular constitution is being drafted, making sure that those are also, so the same type of organizing that's taking place at the community level makes it at the bargaining table. And definitely, as we know, gender and politics, we talk about that the descriptive representation, the substantive representation, and even the symbolic representation, they very much go hand in hand. Thank you so much. We have exactly 30 minutes for question and answer. Homa, and I'm wondering, is Shireen with us?
But
Yeah.
she was supposed to be with us, but I don't see her name among here.
But Huma, Mahin Sultan, who's with the Women's Commission, is
Yes.
here. If you
Oh, I was going to
Yes,
say, yes,
that's what
yes.
I
it
was
would-
going to say. I think Sultan is here, and so maybe we ask her to comment and especially talk a little bit more about also the commission, which we are all, especially at Bloom, we are very interested in that. Yeah, Florence.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you to Cynthia and Sarah for bringing out a lot of interesting points. And I was very happy to, pleased to hear Cynthia's analysis, because I'm also with the BRAC University Institute of Governance and Development, and we have been also looking at the reform process and how, the women's agenda has been treated in the reform process also from a research angle. But talking from the Commission, as Sarah has said, I'd like to emphasize that one of the things that was criticisms that was done, that this was a middle-class commission talking to middle-class women, not at all representative. But I think as commission members, we brought together a wealth of experience and knowledge, which shouldn't be discounted. Years of feminist struggles, of development work. And we had people like Sarah and Fauzia, Karim, bringing in, a lot of people worked voluntarily to bring in their expertise and inputs. And also we did try to go beyond, just what's, being said in Dhaka, but to reach out to various communities. And just to come back to what Cynthia was saying, I think the women's movement has moved towards, considering women as citizens and establishing citizens' rights. But one of the things, reflecting on what the commission did and didn't do, I think we overestimated the power of the interim government and what it could do. And we put too much faith in those structures. And we underestimated the power of the political parties and what they could undo. And that the negotiation would really happen at the level of the political parties. And the interim government, which had set up the commission, would sort of disown everything that had been said by the commission, and would even disown the commissions, saying that this isn't us, this is their opinion, we have nothing to do with it, as soon as the criticism started coming in. So politically, maybe we didn't play things right, looking back now. But we felt that in order to establish what the women's agenda should be and would be, and forward-looking, really feminist agenda, we felt that if from the beginning we negotiated with the political parties, we wouldn't be able to have an independent voice and set out the agenda independently. So whether it was accepted or not, it did create a big reaction. And I think people talked about it. Even if they binned it, they were still talking about it. I think our report was the most talked about report. And, it's still debated. But we found that at the ministry level, some of the things were picked up. And one thing which I think was a success, the women's movement owned the report. And I think that is one of the things we can be proud of, that they saw it as a document that is theirs, that will guide them. And when we have had other interactions with feminist groups in the region, they also felt that it represented, something that the region could also say was part of their demands. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was incredible. We are very interested in the commission and the debates around it. Unfortunately, much of what is there for us, unfortunately, it's not in English. So we have been trying with some of our wonderful colleagues at Bragg to trying to find out more, so that share that experience with the rest of the Muslim context, and especially where people in the countries where either they transition, they are going through transition, or that transition is viewed down the line rather quickly. And so it will be actually very important for us to have session on discussion of that, how it was happened, how it was organized, what went wrong, what we could do, and what other contexts can learn from it. Anyway, thank you very much for your incredible
And I'd be happy to share an English version. It still isn't final and formal, but I could share it with you and you can pass it to this group.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. So maybe, Monodon, if you have a comment, maybe you share, and otherwise we open to the
Yes. No, I'm very eager. And as I said, I mean, it's so important to also recognize the achievements as well. And what's really interesting with the commission, you're completely correct to say that it was the most talked about report. It was also the most attacked report. And usually as feminists, we say that when you actually are attacked a lot, that means you're doing something right? That means you're pushing some buttons that need to be pushed. So in that regard, I think that in itself is it really does require an analysis, right? To be able to understand, what were you pushing for, and when it comes to the bargaining power that I talked about, where is it that some of that sort of coalition buildings, didn't materialize the way it was supposed to materialize? We do have a comment. I think we have several comments as well. But I'm thinking, so Olirsun mentioned, but we really didn't go through the constitutional reform process, and the Women's Commission was completely ignored, sidelined, especially in the referendum, which has to do with sort of the attack that I was mentioning. I'm wondering, Cynthia, if you have any comments on that, and then opening it up. I do see colleagues from Iran as well joining us, because this is exactly what we talked about is something that translates is very much to other contexts as well, right? That although you have women at the forefront of revolutions, although women's issues and gender equality is so foundational to any democratic process and democratic transition, then suddenly you're not seeing that taking place. And when it comes to, in fact, having it document, sometimes even those get ignored. Go ahead, please.
So, interesting responses. I'm just going to kind of consolidate everything that I've heard just really quickly. Regarding the equality clause, yes, it's textual. So my it was more of a caution. I was just throwing out a caution in terms of institutional design, right? Designs, text that you put in constitutions. Had the distinction been silent, I think that we wouldn't have to depend so much on the court's interpretation, right? Because courts are also not independent. And so we might get a progressive interpretation on the one hand, and that could be rolled back years later. And so I think my sort of caution in the wind was related to that. It's also interesting to hear from Professor Mahin Sultan. I think that I completely agree that there was no engagement with the political parties. So as I was sort of watching all this unfold, by December 2024, especially when the Consensus Commission was formed, and I thought this is a terrible format for any kind of constitutional transitions, right? Because it's not being led by the political parties, and there was no engagement with the political parties. many had said, "Oh, she's the negative Nancy," right? But I was sort of like watching things more from a comparative constitutional perspective, and I thought, this does not feel like it's going the right way. Regarding the final question about we didn't go through the constitutional reform process, and yes, the Women's Commission was completely sidelined. The referendum itself, I've been very critical of the referendum process itself. It bundled so many issues together, and it was not, as is typically the case, like, you can look at Chile, which is the most recent example. You can look at Thailand, which is another example. So normally you have an entry referendum and an exit referendum. So you pose the question that should we change certain things? And then you go back and you deliberate, and then you present the changes back to the public. And then you say, do you approve these changes? Right? That's not what happened here. This was sort of 82 issues that were bundled together and said, oh, here we go. Like, please, yes or no to all of these issues, right? So effectively, as a voter, I didn't have the choice of disagreeing with certain issues and agreeing with some. And so I think that the entire reform process, the constitutional reform process itself was flawed in that respect. You could have the best, most well-intentioned reforms, but process is so important, and how inclusive that process is, and who's at the negotiating table. And that's really what also determines the longevity and the endurance of those particular constitutional changes. Because, in contexts like ours, these changes could also be rolled back very, very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I fully agree with that. Yes, I would like to open the floor. Please feel free to unmute to ask your question. Raise your hands so that we can keep it. Okay, dear Azadeh, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Value for this very timely event, and a special thank you to Cynthia for very informative and thought-provoking talk. As you mentioned correctly, the situation in Bangladesh is very similar to the other part of the world, including Iran. And towards your conclusion, you mentioned that constitutional moments required organization, not only mobilization. So I'm wondering if you have some strategies or some techniques that you could provide based on your experience, which would be, I think, helpful and useful for the Iranian context. Thank you.
Okay, Cynthia, why don't you respond, and then we go to the next question.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm afraid, I'm not going to claim any expertise for the Iranian context. You have the experts right here. So in terms of strategies, I think for me, when I look at the Bangladesh context, my position is always sort of, if you don't empower women in the home, because that's the perspective that I came across. This public-private distinction has bothered me for a long time, and I'm so glad I can talk about it now. Is that if you don't remove those everyday structural barriers, it's not going to help you eventually, because the constitutional moments are, volatile, and if the women aren't ready, right? I don't think gains will be sustainable. And so, I'll give you an example. In the Bangladesh context, it's new research that I'm undertaking. Debt is criminalized, right? And I think it's the same case in Egypt. It's the same case in many post-colonial countries. And so, so that's one aspect, but also over sort of incarceration in general, our default is look at the criminal law, right? So if you, there's a finite amount of energy by the time you get to a constitutional moment. And that window, you can only put in one or two things on your agenda. You can't put the whole gamut of things, right? Not everything will stick, right? To put it crudely. And so I feel like that in the ordinary times, we have to mobilize, whether it's the legislature, whether it's the courts, whether it's just policy advocacy. So if we pick our causes, like I can't work on all 100 causes, but there's plenty of other people that do. So what we do in normal times, outside of these volatile times, is to really try and chip away at those things. If we skirt around issues, we think, oh, okay, this is going to annoy the religious groups, and we're not going to touch on that. You're not going to achieve anything, right? At some point, you're going to have to confront the political realities. And there's no nice way of saying, actually, I want equal rights and inheritance. There's no nice way of saying that. It's going to annoy them. And so we have to figure out how to have these uncomfortable conversations. And one way around it, I think, is also, I've thought for a long time when I've been looking at this debt research, is that, my God, women are, the intergenerational kind of wealth accumulation. We are so deprived. And, the conditions of sort of, the middle century Arabia is no longer true. And so, and we also live in capitalist systems, and there's a lot of labor exploitation, and there's a lot of, informal economy where women participate and work, and it's completely unrecognized. And so, this is a major hurdle to accumulation of wealth and intergenerational wealth for women. So we're kind of stuck in a cycle, if you like. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Is there any other question? No, if I may use my situation just to give you a little story about what actually what Cynthia said remind me of when I was doing research in Iran, because in Iran it's not clear whether women can be president or not. So a lot of people actually try to put themselves as a candidate and then they are rejected, but they're not said why they are rejected. I was interviewing a lot of people, so being an anthropologist, of course. Then I was asking women whether they agree with women being president or not. It was a focus group, and they just laughed. They said, "Well, yeah, it's okay if they were the president, but what if she had to go to UN or some other important thing, and her husband denied her right to travel? Because in Iran, husbands have the right. In fact, in many Muslim countries, I'm not sure about Bangladesh, they have to have the permission of their husband, not their father, but their husband to travel. So they said, maybe you have to solve that problem first before we have a president, because otherwise, not the work of family or the work of country is going to be solved. So I think it's very important. Often, sometimes as a feminist, we just think of a big picture, not of the little one, but this small units actually is where the change, the deep change happens. And so, as Cynthia says, it sometimes is uncomfortable to raise some of these things because they are legitimized through religion, but there's no way we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. Okay, the floor is open for other comments.
Yes, go ahead, Ulursun. Yes.
I just wanted to add to the previous point, because especially in terms of, I think, political parties, all political parties included, because there was a sort of a common platform for political parties to discuss all these issues together, and they also came to, well, I mean, the July Charter is supposed to represent some sort of consensus amongst the political parties, but there was no consensus because some political parties agreed to certain points, some parties did not. So it was actually a mess in that sense. And I think the Women's Affairs Commission was actually put under the bus because the Islamist groups specifically targeted the Women's Rights Commission's report. And especially, the provision with, equal rights of inheritance and all of that. So I think that also gave some sort of agency with the actors who did not really want these, sort of recommendations to be materialized in the first place. So how do you deal with a situation like that? Because, for example, as activists, as, women's rights groups, there were, we were talking about it, there were marches, you maybe publish 2 articles, you write to the government, but then all of that can be so easily ignored when you have on the other end multiple political parties with their own ideologies are heavily advocating against it. So how do you deal with a situation like that? And of course, people were rightly disappointed with the interim government and the way they had to handle it. But then they also were in some way trying not to maybe displease the one of the major parties, BNP, who came to power after the elections. But the sort of odds and the signs that this government also has, especially in terms of its commitment with July Charter, because has been one of the major criticisms against BNP, that they are not seen or viewed as a party that really supports all the provisions in the July Charter, because they had a lot of disagreements, and the July Charter was signed with all those disagreements. And then obviously it was put for referendum and people had voted yes, but then that's also an avenue that BNP is trying to take, because if people have voted yes for the charter, then people have also voted yes for the disagreements that they have within the charter and for certain provisions. So it's really a very I would say almost like a clever way of dodging the responsibilities of actually delivering for the public, including women and other marginalized groups. So I don't know how Cynthia or maybe Sarah is also here. If one of you might respond, I don't know, like how legally can we like hold them accountable, because this is something that has already been passed, like for example a referendum. Of course, it's not ideal the way it should have happened, but is there even any legal way of holding the government accountable because they are not being able to deliver on the commitments that the charter should have delivered? Thank you.
Respond to that?
Yeah,
Yes.
quickly, if you could
Okay.
respond.
Yeah. So the short answer, thank you for that very thoughtful comment. The short answer is that I believe it's been challenged in court, or there's a question that's pending in court about the constitutionality of a constitutional council. So the thing is that I feel like the process was, A, it was rushed, B, it was not well thought out. Constitutional processes around the world, at least the ones that last, they usually think of the next 50 years or the next 100 years. And so your process needs to be really, really sound. And so, there's an institutional question that how do we implement the July Charter? Now, according to the process that emerged, is that we implement it through a constitutional council. Now, the question is, can you have a parallel body in addition to the parliament, right? Because constitutional supremacy. So then there's very technical questions that come up about constitutional supremacy. Are you replacing the parliament? Who's appearing in parliament? Are the same actors, right? So, and then are the same actors, so the MPs are also members of the Constitutional Reform Council. And so I think that, without getting accused of, because you often take positions, and so without getting accused of supporting the BNP necessarily, just from a purely technical constitutional perspective, these are unanswered questions. And as I had mentioned earlier, that my first worry was that the Consensus Commission didn't really engage the political parties. So if you look at previous transitions in Bangladesh, the 1990 transition in particular, was very much led by political party leaders. And it was sort of a transition from military rule into a multi-party system. Here, obviously, we have a situation where, you've had two major parties, and then, of course, one party still, its operations are banned and suspended. And so, there's an asymmetry in the political field. But despite that, I personally don't think that political negotiations are moderated in the way that the Consensus Commission had formatted it. It should have been a negotiation between political parties, and political parties were not leading it. And, they're clever. So they're just going to say, yes, 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 we'll agree with everything. And then, of course, like whenever you're in the seat of power, you roll and you reverse because you can. And so that's exactly what happened. I mean, the actions have been predictable, to say the least. Thanks.
And you're completely correct to say that most political parties do act as gatekeepers, and most political parties are male dominated. So, and these are key institutions that one needs to work with or work within. And that's why some of those within the women's movements across the Muslim world have just been so disillusioned with the sort of the conventional political parties that many are discussing creating a women's political party, and engaging the political power through that. And obviously, then the debate becomes then, are you going to be like sidelining women even farther if you're not engaged? So I think we need to be really conscious that in terms of institutionalization of women's rights, there's various ways, and all of these structures that we want to work within, whether it's the constitution, whether it's the parliament, whether it's political parties, they're all male dominated. So that imaginative context that you spoke about, Cynthia, at the beginning, that you said that, revolutionary moments allow us to then imagine, something new. I think that in itself can be a potential sort of tool that one can use to reimagine some of these institutions and then work towards them and mobilize around them and organize around them. Great. Other questions?
Actually, I think I can't read. Arnajan, can you read? There are quite a few comments in Bengali in the chat. And I don't want our colleagues to feel they are left out. Can you just read the questions maybe then, or comments if there are, because I can't figure out.
Sorry, these comments are just my explanation that you can choose Bengali language. So there are not any Bengali comment, and Sumayapu has just translated.
Oh, perfect.
Whatever. See,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, thank you, because I could see them, but I didn't know whether it's comment. I also wanted to ask, Anna, starting from you and Somaye and Arzu have been working on this to maybe jump in and make a comment. And I also see a couple of hands up. So would you like to make a comment, or if you have a question to?
Thank you, Dr. Farid, for your insightful, presentation. I really learned a lot being from Bangladesh and hearing Dr. Mehidin Sultana. One question like came into my mind when we are talking about women rights reform commissions. So Dr. Sultana mentioned like we underestimated the power of political parties or elites sometimes. So my question to Dr. Farid, you is how can women's movement effectively engage constitutional reform process when political transitions are often dominated by the elite negotiations or power struggle among political actors? Like, what do you think? Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah,
Sorry, I just missed the last.
yeah. Like, how can women movements effectively engage with constitutional reform process, like when political transitions are often being dominated by elite, negotiations or the struggles among the political actors in Bangladesh?
Thank you. And if it's okay, I will bundle this question with
Yes,
the other
I was
two
going to
hands
suggest
that are up. So, dear Azam and dear Somaya.
And I think Afia also had her hands up.
Oh, Afia, if you would like to also add your question. Yes, I think we may have. Yes, go ahead, Azam Jan.
Okay. Thank you very much to organizers and also Dr. Cynthia and Sarah, who discussed things I'm very ignorant about Bangladesh. So I'm very happy that I'm here, and hopefully I will have the chance to read more about your works and the situation there. But the moment of July actually got us. We all watched it, try to understand it, and so it's a chance to add to our knowledge about the events. I understand that talking about the achievements of women movement being
disappeared or demised through time. This question of, generation, that how the new generation would rise up to save or secure what had been achieved, or will be different and indifferent. Her, approach will actually open the space for other forces to come and, just sideline all the achievements. Takes me to the question of the conception of movement, women's movement in this new era and for the new generation. There are moments, when we talk about history of women's movement in Iran, that the activists call it the, a spring of women's movement, because it has its ups and downs. Yeah. And the political situation is one of the factors that shape those ups and downs, but also the change of generation and this new era. In Iran, it's nowadays the, artists, some political figures who just have, have fight very harshly inside the country, and some of the actors, they have more power to talk to the general public, and their support for women's, demands is really critical in these moments. I'm not sure how it goes on in future, but my question is that, you had the women as prime minister. She was a despot. I know it was a revolution against her, but putting as this, there is a difference between the role models in political sphere. In Iran, for us, having women as a minister of one of those ministries is something really important. So it's that close to the women's participation. The system is such close to that. I'm asking that if the intellectual, more, for example, writers, a woman which writes novels and is public in the among the population, or actors, are those part of this movement? Are they have they joined the commission? Were they against it? What happened? The concept is the public figures of the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if, since we're out of time, Sumaya, might you be able to ask your question in 30 seconds?
I'll just take less than 30 seconds. Thank you
Oh,
for
thank
such an amazing talk. My question was based on the current research that I'm doing with Willem, and that's on how we negotiate justice through social media. Understanding that a lot of the reactions that we find and the democratic voice that oftentimes women try to find because of the lack of constitutional acknowledgement then moves forward to social media, particularly mostly on Facebook and Twitter. How do you think then we seek justice where some receive a certain form of justice or an explanation while others remain sidelined? Could you enlighten us a little bit on your observation of this current phenomenon we're going through after the emergence of the new government? I can also type it down if that's okay. Anything
Thank
works,
you.
Dr. Cynthia.
No,
So I'll give you
I
the last
understand
words,
the question.
Cynthia. I know it's 9:30 p.m. in Dhaka. Go ahead.
It's quite okay. Okay, so the first was how can movements contribute to constitutional moments? I think I touched on it in the talk, is that, movements individual, like you can have multiple movements, like women's movement doesn't necessarily have to be homogenous, right? So you have labor movements for women, you have, private life, family law, reform movements for women. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the same people, but it's how do we bring that into a coherent narrative? And that is something that can be done during constitutional moments, especially if there's a coalition amongst them. So I think that that is one way of looking at it. I mean, activists might disagree. I'm not a frontline activist, and so I can't really comment on it with any degree of certainty. But certainly, I think that movements can certainly speak to each other because you can leverage the gains that each of these makes, right? So a gain in the labor sphere can go a long way in claiming for gain in other spheres, right? Because these are also overlapping and intersectional. And so the next question was on writers, actors, and public figures. And I think there was also a comment about having women figures as prime ministers. So I want to answer the women figures first, is that, yes, it's a matter of degrees. And yes, it was acceptable that a woman was in the helm of government. But notice that Bangladesh has a very specific problem in politics, mainly dynastic politics. And dynastic politics is not something that's sort of the top echelon of the political party. If you go all the way down to the lowest denominator in what we call like districts, or even like the micro unit of districts, politics everywhere, there's a degree of nepotism and there's a degree of political patronage that works, right? So this time we had 7 elected female MPs in the parliament. I believe all of them are to some, I mean, this is not to minimize their achievements, but it's just that they all come from political families to some degree. And so again, like they're very capable, but it's just that to even get to the mainstream and get a constituency mobilized, the resources and the kind of social political capital that you need, it's still attached to a certain sort of clan-like family patronage, lineage, and so on and so forth. Regarding intellectuals participating in the movement, actually it was quite divided, because what the Awami League did when it was sort of in the last few years, it completely divided. Also, there's been backlash against many actors and public figures for being enablers of fascism, as it's being called. And so it's been split. Like there have been figures that supported the movement. There's also been figures that are on the other side of sort of the authoritarian regime. And so the last question was, how do we negotiate justice through social media? As someone who's trained in law, it's very difficult to watch media trials, right? On the one hand, yes, there are advantages because you really shed a light on these problems, but also daily outrage is also really exhausting, because what they reveal is that the justice system isn't working. And this is a whole other conversation, but in one line, the criminal justice system in Bangladesh is majorly broken. Right? We don't have a prosecution service. And I've been saying this, like I will die on the hill saying this, that without an independent prosecution service, the institutional levers don't work. And so there are many of these problems. There are also procedural issues that happen. You know, police has problems. Police don't like this. I think the prison population is like 70% under trial prisoners, and the death row convicts are something like 2,700. I think there was a recent report about it. And so the criminal justice system is broken. So when you have social media, media by trial, or vigilante justice, we've seen mobs on and off since 2024. You know, that happens because the formal institutions are not working. So I think that would be my sort of 2 cents that I end with. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing talk, for this engagement. Thank you so much to all of our guests. Thank you so much to Sarah and Maheen also chiming in. I'm so grateful to truly creating a transnational space to be able to discuss some of these issues. So this talk is recorded. We will post it onto our YouTube channel. Give us a little bit of a moment to do that, and then hopefully we can also figure out to go ahead and post the Bengali version as well. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Good. Thank you very much for all of you who came on your Thursday night. And thank you to Cynthia and Sarah for the paper and the commentary, and also for Mahin to join in. I think we do need to have another meeting just looking at the commission and how it works, because that would be an important lesson for the rest for many other countries and contexts, and also for Bangladesh to see how we should do it next time, which, as Cynthia said, maybe is not so far away. So anyways, with this, thanks a lot, and I hope to see you in the next conference or talk soon.
Thank you.
You. Bye.
And I
Thank
wanted to
you.
thank also our team, Arzu, Arna, Samaye, Anama. They have been really helpful.
And Ruhafsa.
And Ruhafsa, who's my right hand. Like,
Thank you.
for supporting this to happen. And we appreciate this very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.